Hello, my name is Ernest Evans. I am a student at Ohio University's main campus. I read Abigail's paper, Frida Used to Explain Feminism in International Relation Theory, and this video will give you my response, my thoughts on everything, and some suggestions that could help to improve the paper. Abigail's paper begins by stating that the purpose of this paper is to address the issues of feminism in the movie Frida and unfold how this describes gender as a variable. She also states that it will understand the anti-feminist aspects of the film Frida. So some of the questions she seeks to answer, or some things that she will analyze, are: what is the overarching theme of feminism in Frida? She will also find the similarities and differences to this theory, and she will also use other resources related to feminism to analyze a controversial topic of today's time, which is very true. It is a rather controversial topic for certain individuals. So page 2 goes into a background on feminism and its evolution through time. The feminist movement started in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and was called the First Wave, and they fought for the right to vote and they wanted privileges to be equal to men. The next movement was called the Second Wave, and that started in the early 1960s. They worked towards more than just the right to vote. They worked towards gaining rights for protection in domestic issues like employment. The third wave, or the third movement, happened in the 1990s and was led by Generation X, or those who were born in the 70s and 80s. They sought to change the thoughts behind womanhood and sexism. Abigail then follows the paper with the definition of feminism. She introduces a person named Courtney Reissig, and she is a writer based out of Little Rock, Arkansas, and she's known for her famous Christian publications. Abigail references the piece The Accidental Feminist, and in that piece, Courtney describes feminism, or I wouldn't just say necessarily describes, but touches upon feminism as the belief that equality equals sameness. If men and women are equal, then they must be the same in role, ability, and function. But what if you don't hold the belief that men and women should be or are the same? Are you off the hook as a feminist? Abigail felt this was the most interesting because it offers a look into some women's perspective of that they don't believe they should be equal to men's persona, as she states. Page 3 dives into Adam Jones' viewpoint on feminism and questions. Adam Jones' viewpoint questions whether or not women should be equal to men. She then follows with a quote from Cynthia Weber, on page 92. It was only in the late 1980s when feminist questions pushed their way onto the IR agenda through books, journals, and conferences that feminism suddenly seemed attractive to IR scholars, and explains that gender is a variable, only functions so long as it can claim not just a gender-neutral status, equality to all genders, but a gender-free status, being outside of gender altogether, and this was on Weber, page 94. This allows an international relations theorist to view gender as a variable without acting through a gender. Following that, the paper goes into the movie Frida. So, after the opening scene, one is taken to the life of Frida as she was as a schoolgirl. In this scene, she is introduced to Diego Rivera, who will play a major role in this movie and will later become her husband. So, it is in this scene that Frida gets her first taste of the kind of man that Diego Rivera really is. She gets this when she sees him painting a big mural of a naked woman on a wall with a living model in front of him. And his current wife comes in to bring him dinner, but she is upset with the fact that the quote-unquote whore is still present, so she throws the food she prepared for him on the ground and storms out. Diego doesn't do anything to consolate his wife, and in fact, he actually starts to make a joke of it by kissing the model until Frida plays a joke and says that Lupe, who is Diego's wife at the time, is on her way back into the room. In a way, Diego's love for Frida can ruin her life of painting in her career. This is relating to Frida. In a way, Diego's love for Frida can ruin her life of painting and her career if he does something wrong and upsets her because she is easily hostile. As I mentioned earlier, she is an iconoclast, so she stands outside of the traditional boundaries, if you will. Kind of messed up to say that, but you will see, and this is what Abigail's paper is actually getting at, is how really messed up this movie Frida can be in certain areas. So, in this case, when he sleeps with her sister, she goes on a binge where she's depressed, drunk, and lonely until Macho Diego comes back and saves her from herself, which is kind of playing on like the whole mentality that girls are reliant upon men for emotional support, which is definitely not the case. Just because she's portrayed as an independent and empowered female does not mean she automatically takes away the agency from the men in her life. Abigail, I actually had a question about that, and I'm going to mention that in my critique section later. But she then states that one can even view it as a humanistic perspective on the complexity of power dynamic relations. Page 4 goes into her husband, Diego, was being how he used to be a very self-sufficient, or actually is a very self-sufficient man. Gives example of him painting a live nude model, and then talks about how even though Frida was very independent, she still relied upon Diego at the same time, and that's kind of what kept Diego really like fascinated with her. That doesn't seem to be the right word, but that's what I'll go with. So Frida was very caught up with him until Diego goes and sleeps with her sister, and they had cut off all connections and everything until later back in life whenever they would get together. Page 5 of Abigail's paper shows Diego subjugating women. He doesn't consult, this goes back to the example of him not consoling his wife even when she was upset with the whole nude model thing. And she relates this to the Dan Gallagher example, which a lot of us mentioned in our responses for that module, how Dan Gallagher found national security in his family. Diego finds it in his artwork, politics, and whores. And so like Dan Gallagher, him getting a mistress becomes a problem. For Diego, whenever he gets a wife, that becomes a problem. And that is the connection that Abigail makes between the two examples. Back to Frida. Going back, her family home was very Catholic, very strict, and it all evolved around a courtyard. And in this courtyard, her family spent most of their time doing their everyday tasks, like planning her sister's marriage and providing for the family. She called it very safe because the males worked outside while the females worked inside. This goes back to the very, traditional mindsets, and back to her coming from a strict Catholic family and her being very restricted. So her mother realized that her daughter was going to be a problem for the first time whenever Frida wore a suit for a family picture. And Abigail also mentions how Frida would sneak around and sleep with her boyfriend in her armor when the family was busy. Kind of funny. So Frida starts to slowly gain some more freedom. Then she's involved in a bus accident, leaves her incapable of walking for a long duration of time. So she's stuck at home, and the boyfriend leaves her for her new life in Europe. And that's when Frida realizes that the man that she is attached to is going to miss out on the best days of her life when she's able to walk again. Page 6 of Abigail's paper goes into Freedom regaining her health, and as she was regaining her health, she found that painting was her passion, and she was also able to make a means of living out of it. She showed Diego her work for his honest opinion, and he liked it. Diego and Frida then go to a party later on, and there was a challenge by the host of who could take the biggest chug of alcohol, and whoever could would get a dance with her. There was 3 competitors. There was Frida, Diego, and some other gentlemen. Frida was willing to challenge. This showed everyone that Frida was willing to challenge anyone, and she was fearless, and she actually ended up winning the competition. But at the same night that Frida showed that she was willing to challenge anyone and that she was fearless, Diego swoops in and Frida falls for Diego. This shows the insecurities in Frida's life. She falls for a man that could potentially break her heart and ruin her means of providing a living for herself. Abigail goes on to reference the day that Diego asked Frida to get married, and they both set guidelines for each other because they are both very independent, very different people. They knew that. Frida wanted loyalty from Diego, and Diego just warned her that he likes to sleep with other women, but would only love her. And Abigail states that this is where there should have been red flags raised, which is quite natural. I mean, I would not want to marry someone who would want to sleep around with other people but promise not to love anyone else. That makes no sense. Anyways, so page 7 of Abigail's paper goes into the myths of feminism and Frida. Abigail recollects about how her grandmother told her to dress nicely and behave accordingly. Second nature for Frida, and this was second nature for Frida because of her upbringing, but this manifested as she grew older and found who she was and became more comfortable. This goes back to the example of her wearing a suit for a family portrait, or starting a bar fight with a gentleman who confronted her husband for being a communist. Then Abigail goes on to talk about how there's the idea that women are supposed to remain calm and proper. Frida was a very stubborn and bullheaded lady. She wanted what she wanted, and she believed she was in the right. For example, and for an example of how she behaved improperly, she made vegetables look like male genitalia, which is hilarious. Next example that Abigail talks about is women knowing how to cook. Abigail finds this one very interesting, and it stood out to her. Lupe and Frida slowly became friends, and Lupe offered to help Frida learn to cook Diego's favorite dish because Diego would want it all the time. Next, from the beginning, when the audience sees the accident, one can see that having a baby could be almost impossible for Frida. She tried to have a baby and failed. And another expectation of women that Abigail mentions is how women are, there's a right way to act, and in that right way to act, they are not meant to talk about politics. Abigail goes on to mention that politics will become a main subject in the movie Frida, and after meeting Diego, Frida actually joins the Mexican communism movement, which terrifies her family, and they state that it could put her life at risk. So that's a summary of Abigail's paper. To go into my notes and my critiques, in the first paragraph or second paragraph, you directly mention the first movement as a first wave, just to make it easier to understand for the readers. Like, for example, I knew this personally confused me. I would probably change that to maybe like feminist movements, just because you hadn't mentioned what first wave yet was. Or like, you also mentioned tried to crack the code throughout time. What is the code that they are trying to crack? Is it just a theory of feminism and its role in international relations, or I'm not sure, but maybe if you could elaborate on that, that would help to make your paper stronger, because it gives the reader a better background and a better understanding of what you're getting at. So let's see, what else did I mention? So gaining rights for protection in domestic issues like employment, I think that was the second wave you were talking about. Yes. Are you talking about equal pay? Maybe you could elaborate on it. Just mention like issues like employment, such as equal pay. Like equal pay for the genders, something like that. Womanhood and sexism, I was thinking maybe you could define that just to give a little more background. Let's see, maybe you could define iconoclast. That's not a very common word for people. And other than that, there's just like some minor like grammar things, a few awkward sentences, but it's a rough draft. I know my paper had quite a few issues going on with it. But and there's one thing for sure was you used like weather, like the weather outside instead of like weather, WHETHER. But some of these, like, you know, minor corrections and stuff, I've actually went ahead and highlighted in the document for you in your version and just added my own notes. So I'll go ahead and email that to you. Overall, I thought like the draft was really good. I'm actually really excited to see where you go with this paper, because I find it really interesting. You talked about how, you know, there's that stereotype that women are supposed to know how to cook, you know, or, you know, just to go into like those like ideas that people have, the traditional ideas of what people had, you know, of what women are supposed to be able to do. Is very interesting to me. But anyway, this was my review of Abigail's paper. Hopefully this will help you out a lot, Abigail, and we can keep in touch and help each other to make our papers even better. Cool. Thank you.